Hi guys, welcome back to week 8 of what will probably be a 10-week series on the canonization of Scripture. I was looking at material this week and I think we probably have more for about 2 more weeks. So we'll talk about that as the time draws near. Make sure you've got your notes from wherever you've got them, Facebook, the email, the comments in this viewing, and get them in front of you so you can follow along. Now, when we left off last week, there were 2 different versions of the Bible that were vying for dominance in England. The first was the Geneva Bible, which was extremely popular, but also came with some controversy because of its marginal notes. There were notes in the margin that appeared to be Calvinistic, and so there were some people who weren't all that excited about those notes. And so as a response to the Geneva Bible, there came the Bishops Bible. The Bishops Bible was a revision of the Great Bible, which had been, by law, the Bible of England, but with its revision, the Bishops Bible became the lawful Bible of England, although it wasn't as popular as the Geneva Bible. And so there was division in the church because there wasn't unity around one authorized Bible. Well, in 1603, Elizabeth I died, and the crown of England passed to James I, who had already been king in Scotland for 36 years. Due to the complaints and the division within the church, King James called a conference at Hampton Court in 1604 to address these issues. And while at that conference, a man named Dr. John Reynolds, who was an Oxford scholar and a leader on the Puritan side of the Church of England, he raised the subject of the imperfections of having 2 Bibles, and suggested that there might be a new translation, specifically one without marginal notes. Now, he wasn't necessarily referring to notes that will help you understand the Hebrew or Greek better. He was referring to notes like the Calvinistic ones that he didn't really agree with. King James was intrigued by this because King James wasn't a fan of the Geneva Bible either. He thought that the notes found in the Geneva Bible undermined some of the authority of kings, and so go figure that he would want a new version. And so he was intrigued by the possibility of a version that was translated by university scholars, approved by bishops, and inevitably ratified by the king. And so he took a leading role in organizing this project. There were 6 panels of about 50 men total that worked on the translation. 3 of those panels worked on the Old Testament. 1 of them worked on translating the Apocryphal books, and 2 panels worked on the New Testament. 2 panels met in Oxford, 2 met in Cambridge, and 2 met in Westminster. And when those panels completed their assignments, the entire work was reviewed by a smaller group of 12 men, 2 men from each panel. And the work was sent then to bishops and churchmen for review. Now, James also set the rules for how they would translate and present the Scriptures. For instance, the Bishop's Bible was the one that was going to be used as the basis for this translation, but it was supposed to be examined alongside the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. And so the King James Version really began as a revision of the Bishop's Bible, with many other sources being used alongside of it. It was agreed that italics would be used for words that were not present in the Hebrew or Greek. Now, some people who read the King James Version today might think that those words are more important, but the reality is that they've been added to help people understand things that were not initially in the Greek or the Hebrew. So let me give you an example of that. In 1 John chapter 4 of the King James Version, verse 3, we read this: "And every spirit that confesseth not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God. And this is that spirit of Antichrist, whereof ye have heard that it should come, and even now already is it in the world." Now you notice there that the word spirit is in italics right before Antichrist, because it is less clear to write, "and this is that of Antichrist." you would naturally ask, well, that what? And that spirit is what we're talking about. And so even though the word spirit isn't found in Hebrew and Greek, it's inserted there in the King James in italics so the reader is better able to understand it. Another rule in the King James Bible was that the names of biblical characters were to correspond as closely as possible to those in common use. In the Bishops Bible, in the Geneva Bible, the names were conformed to the original form. But let me give you an example of that. We know today the son of Abraham as Isaac. We call him Isaac, I-S-A-A-C. But in the Geneva Bible or the Bishop's Bible, it was actually Isaac, I-S-A-H-A-C, which is reasonably close to the Hebrew. And so in the King James Version, those Hebrew spellings were to be avoided. We also mentioned just a moment ago that there were no marginal notes other than the explanation of a Hebrew or a Greek word. The existing chapters and verses were to be retained, but there were new headings that were given for the different chapters. The names of all the revisers for this new version were approved by the king. Among them were some of the finest scholars of that day. For instance, one of them, Lancelot Andrewes, was the Dean of Winchester and had mastered 15 different languages. But perhaps the most famous of them was Dr. John Reynolds, the man whose words at Hampton Court had kind of initiated this project. He gave himself so fully to the work that even while lying on his deathbed, members of the committee would bring him samples of their translations to seek his advice. Well, the work of revising really began in 1607, and in 1611, the new version was finally printed. It was first known as the Authorized version. The Bible was 1,500 pages, printed in double columns, and on the title page, it read, "Appointed to be read in churches," although there's no record of any decree ordaining its use. On that first printing, the title formed the center of a decorative engraving, flanked on either side by Moses and Aaron. In the four corners of the title page, or of the cover rather, we find Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John with their symbolic animals. And just above the title page, in the middle area, are the figures of Peter and Paul. At the very top is the name of God in Hebrew, and beneath it is the sacred dove, which represents the Spirit, and even further down than that is the Lamb. At the very bottom is a picture of a pelican wounding herself with her beak to feed her young with her own blood, the symbol of Christ's redeeming work. Now, the Authorized version was dedicated to King James and was printed 3 times in its first year of publication. And those early editions had quite a number of misprints and variations in wording and in spelling. One of those misspellings, or one of those misprints rather, has been perpetuated over time in continuing editions even until today. That's found in Matthew chapter 23, verse 24, that gives us the term strain at a gnat instead of strain out a gnat. That was never corrected in later translations, and many people since have come to use that phrase, strain at a gnat, even though it was wrongly used in the first place. In an edition printed in 1631, the word not in the 7th commandment was omitted. The king's printers were fined £300 by the archbishop for the error, and the edition eventually got the nickname the Wicked Bible because it more or less encouraged people, not just encouraged, but commanded them to commit adultery. There was a version printed in Oxford in 1717 that accidentally gave a heading for Luke chapter 23 that said the parable of the vinegar instead of the parable of the vineyard. That has come to be known as the Vinegar Bible. In 1795, there was an edition that mistakenly used the word killed instead of the word filled in the passage in Mark 7:27 that says, "Let the children first be filled." Well, with it instead saying killed, that Bible came to be known as the Murderer's Bible. That's a pretty significant mistake, right? Over the course of time, these spelling errors and misprints were corrected. And in 1701, an edition of the Authorized version was printed that really became the true Authorized version. And while the Authorized version replaced the Bishop's Bible, it still continued to struggle against the Geneva Bible for about half a century as they existed side by side. But eventually the Authorized version won out because of its superior merit and its freedom from party or sectarian spirit. Eventually there would be revisions made at Cambridge in 1762, at Oxford in 1769, that really modernized the English and made it more easily readable in our day. And that's basically the version of the King James that we read today when we're reading it. But as with any new version of the Bible, the Authorized version didn't get away without criticism. Dr. Hugh Broughton, who was a biblical scholar of great influence, had been omitted from the list of revisers on account of the fact that though he was brilliant, he wasn't very much of a team player. As one might expect, he was extremely critical of the King James Version of 1611. He condemned the whole thing as idle words for which the translators would one day be held responsible at the day of judgment. His comments surely would have graced our social media platforms today, as he said this about the Scriptures, that he would rather be rent in pieces by wild horses than any such translation by his consent should be urged upon poor churches. Broughton also remarked that the cockles of the seashores and the leaves of the forest and the grains of the poppy may as well be unnumbered as the gross errors of this Bible, disgracing the ground of our own hope. Well, hope somehow survived. And by the late 17th century, the Authorized version was extremely popular. For some 250 years, when English Protestants spoke of the Bible, they usually meant the Authorized version of 1611. And what made the Authorized version so trustworthy was the fact that it was done by a group of scholars and not one individual. So it didn't represent a minority point of view, and the absence of the controversial marginal notes helped make the version acceptable to readers of different belief systems. Not only that, but in the half century prior to the Authorized version, there had been a great growth in English literature. There were writers like Spenser and Marlowe and Shakespeare who had really raised the standards of literary taste. And the revisers of the Authorized version, they entered into this rich kind of heritage and left us with what's really a monument of Elizabethan prose. In one sense, the King James Version is a far greater literary work than are the books of the New Testament and the original Greek. The influence of the Authorized version can't really be overstated as far as the English language and English literature is concerned. Every book and newspaper today has been influenced by the Authorized version in some way. Expressions we have like the skin of their teeth or lick the dust or salt of the earth, these all come from the Authorized version of the Bible. Beyond that, however, has been its religious significance. The Authorized version has been the literature of millions who have read little else. And it has been the source of the knowledge of salvation and the guide of conduct for countless millions of people for several hundred years. Frederick Kenyon, in his book called Our Bible and the Ancient Manuscripts, says, "As time went on, the Authorized version acquired the prescriptive right of age. Its rhythms became familiar to the ears of all the classes its language entered into our literature, and Englishmen became prouder of their Bible than of any of the creative works of their own literature. Well, between 1611 and 1800, at least 1,000 editions of the Authorized version were published. And up to the end of the 19th century, it was uncontested as far as biblical supremacy was concerned. But it's not like biblical translation just ceased between the 18th and 19th centuries. As early as 1703, there were some who were trying to revise the Authorized version. In fact, between 1611 and 1881, at least 70 private versions of the Bible in English were being published. They were simply overwhelmed by the popularity of the Authorized version. But as with all things, change is inevitable. And not only did the English language continue to change, but more important than that, there were new discoveries that gave us greater improvements in biblical texts, especially in the Greek New Testament. And as those discoveries came to be found, there became the need for what some people thought should be a revision of the King James Version. And so in 1870, the Bishop of Winchester, who was named Dr. Samuel Wilberforce, recommended that a revision of the New Testament of the Authorized version be undertaken. That recommendation would later expand to include the Old Testament as well. And so a committee of 16 men was appointed to supervise this revision. Inevitably, they came up with 54 different men who were responsible for the work. And they divided themselves into two companies, one for each testament. Now, the scholars belonged both to the Church of England and to other denominations, such as the Church of Scotland and Baptists and Methodists, Congregationalists, and even others. And there was also a group of American Christians, American scholars, who worked on this translation, which we'll discuss a little bit more in a few moments. It was agreed that the revisers would introduce only changes that would bring the Authorized version more closely in line with the original Hebrew and Greek. Each company went over their revised portions twice, and any changes that were going to be made after that second screening could only be made with the approval of a 2/3 vote among those in the company. The revisers of the Authorized version introduced these changes. The first was alterations due to the adoption of a different Greek text from that of the Authorized version. The second was improvements where the Authorized version was ambiguous. The third was simply the correction of errors that were still in the Authorized version. The fourth were alterations where the Authorized version was inconsistent in the rendering of the Greek by different English words. And finally, the headings of chapters, pages, paragraphs, the headings of chapters, the pages, the paragraphs, italics, and the punctuation in the Authorized version, those were also going to be revised. Now, this revision began in 1870. And after 11 years, in 1881, the New Testament of the Revised Version was finally published. Now, you want to talk about demand. It was published on May 17th in England. And 3 days later, on May 20th, it was on sale in the United States. There was tremendous demand for it in the States, especially in the cities of New York and Philadelphia. And it's estimated that 3 million copies of the version were sold in England and America within less than a year of its publication. It came to be known as the English Revised Version, or the ERV. While sales were very quick, so were the debates concerning its merit. Although the Revised New Testament had a better Greek as its base, the English of the translation left a whole lot to be desired, even though it reflected some improvements over the Authorized version. And in their efforts to be as faithful to the Greek as possible, it seems that the revisers paid too little attention to English style. Had it been a more readable English version. It likely would have replaced the Authorized version, but as it was, this didn't happen. And so while it sold a whole lot of copies initially, it did not sustain popularity the way that the Authorized version did. So while it took 11 years, 1881, to publish the New Testament, it took 14 years to publish the Revised Old Testament. The Apocryphal books were not originally part of the project, but they actually did get printed 10 years later. All in all, the English Revised Version is a very accurate version, and it's still widely used as a study Bible, but it never replaced the Authorized version in popularity. Charles Spurgeon, you've probably heard of him. He was the most renowned preacher of that time. He called the Revised Version strong in Greek, but weak in English. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the project to create the Revised Version included American scholars as well. The English reviewers would send their revision in its various stages across the ocean to the Americans, and they promised to take the Americans' suggestions as seriously as they could before the final draft was sent to printers. The suggestions that the English revisers could not accept were to appear in an appendix of the Authorized or of the Revised Version. And the Americans were asked to pledge their moral support for this new version, and they were also asked not to create their own version for a term of 14 years. But in true American fashion, as soon as those 14 years were over, the Americans were ready with their own Revised Version. Now, among the American Committee's suggestions that had not been approved were some that may very well have improved the readability and also the popularity of the English Revised Version. For instance, they wanted the word Jehovah instead of the word Lord, the word astonished instead of the English word astonished, the words turned away instead of eschewed, the word spirit instead of ghost, the word covenant instead of testament, and other changes like those. They wanted to eliminate more of the old, outdated words and phrases and use words that were much more modern and much more readable. And so in August of 1901, this new edition was published by Thomas Nelson and Sons and became known as the American Standard Version. This version had a more readable style than its English counterpart and became much more popular in America than did the English Revised Version in England. Eventually, in 1971, there would be a revision of that one called the New American Standard that we'll talk about a little more in the following weeks to come. But despite its popularity, it didn't become as popular still as the Authorized Version, which had become extremely popular in the United States, but was better known now as the King James Version. Most of you probably don't know that in 1971, the King James II version came out, or the King James II version, we might call it, published by Associated Publishers and Authors. It was the work of a man named J. Green, but inevitably was found to be inferior to the original. Then in 1979, Thomas Nelson and Sons published the New Testament part of the New King James Bible. A group of 119 scholars representing various denominations did a moderate revision of the 1611 King James Bible. In the introduction, the publishers declare that the New King James Bible seeks to produce a revised English edition which will unlock the spiritual treasures found uniquely in the King James Version of the Holy Scriptures. Whatever that means. The project was completed in 1982 and cost $3.5 million to do so. Reviews have been mixed, but still has never gained the popularity that the King James Bible has in America. Well, many of you probably know people who today still claim that the King James Version is the most accurate version of the Bible, and so continue to use it and refuse to use anything else. Is that true? Is the King James Version still the most accurate? Is it the one that we should be using? And how do more recent versions compare to the great printing publication that is the King James Version? We'll begin discussing those other versions next week, week 9. Looking forward to seeing you next week. God bless.